It was a warm autumn evening when I found myself driving home after another long day at the office. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the street, and the usual tinge of fatigue was settling into my bones. I was ready to get home, put my feet up, and forget about the stack of work waiting for me tomorrow. But as I made my way down the road, the sudden flash of red and blue lights from my rearview mirror jolted me from my thoughts. My heart skipped a beat as I instinctively pulled over, the sinking feeling in my stomach growing. Another traffic stop. I'd been pulled over a handful of times before, but this one felt different somehow. I glanced in the mirror, trying to prepare myself for whatever this officer might say, but I couldn't shake the sense of unease that gripped me. I wasn't speeding, my registration was up to date. So why was I being stopped? The officer approached with measured steps, his uniform crisp and dark against the fading light. When he reached my window, I noticed how tall he was, his presence commanding but not overtly aggressive. There was something about his eyes that held my attention, a deep intensity, like he was studying me rather than just checking my license. "Good evening," he said, his voice steady and professional. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" I shook my head, trying to stay composed despite the nervous flutter in my chest. "No, officer, I'm not sure. You were driving a little too close to the line," he replied. His voice was even, but there was an underlying tension that felt almost personal. "I just wanted to make sure everything's all right." I nodded, hoping my own voice didn't betray the unease I was feeling. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize." Without another word, the officer gestured for me to step out of the car. My heart hammered in my chest as I complied, the night air cool against my skin. What was happening? It was just a minor infraction. Why was he asking me to step out? As we walked toward the back of the car, I could sense the officer's gaze on me, but I couldn't quite figure out what it meant. His eyes didn't feel like the usual type of glance a cop gives to a driver. They were searching, lingering, like he was seeing something more than just a routine stop. I couldn't quite place it, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. The officer checked my papers, running through the usual questions. His tone remained professional, but something about the way he interacted with me felt different. There was no judgment, no rush, just a strange stillness between us. After a few minutes, he handed me back my documents. "You're free to go," he said with a curt nod. "Drive safe." "Thanks," I replied, my voice a little too strained, a little too rushed. My mind was still racing, trying to make sense of the whole thing. I climbed back into my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I pulled away. But even as I drove off, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was unresolved between us, something unspoken. As I drove through the quiet streets, the unsettling encounter lingered in my thoughts. Who was that officer? What was it about the way he looked at me that had made everything feel so different? It wasn't just the stop. It was the way he had studied me, as if there was something more he wanted to say, something more we had to share. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't sure what to make of it. But one thing was for certain, I wasn't likely to forget him anytime soon. The days passed after my strange encounter with the officer, and I tried my best to put it out of my mind. Work, family, errands. Life had a way of sweeping you up and keeping you busy. But as I moved through my daily routine, that odd encounter lingered in my thoughts. There was something compelling about it, something that kept me coming back to that brief, almost fleeting interaction. I couldn't shake the thought that it was more than just another traffic stop, more than just another random moment in a city full of faces I would never see again. No, this was different. Curiosity gnawed at me. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched in that fleeting moment, but rather the sense of unfinished business. The officer's eyes, they had felt like they were searching, like they were trying to tell me something without saying a word. I knew it was probably all in my head. After all, I didn't know him. He was just a man doing his job. Yet, somehow, the encounter stuck with me. It was on a particularly gray, overcast day that I found myself walking past Chipotle. The lunch rush was over, and the usually crowded corner felt quieter. Something in the back of my mind nudged me toward the restaurant. I was hungry, yes, but there was another pull, one I couldn't quite explain. The officer had been there before, and I couldn't deny that I was curious whether I'd run into him again. Maybe he wasn't so far removed from that strange moment we shared. Maybe there was more to him than just a quick traffic stop. I pushed the door open, the familiar clang of the bell above the entrance marking my arrival. I scanned the room, and there he was, sitting in the same corner by the window, just as I remembered. It was as though nothing had changed. But there was a subtle difference now. I was more aware of him. I wasn't sure if he had noticed me yet, but I felt the pull of our past interaction already building, the quiet sense of recognition hanging in the air. I stood there for a moment, uncertain whether I should approach or just go about my business as if nothing had happened. It was only a traffic stop, after all, but then I realized, what harm could it do to just say hello? I moved to the counter, placing my order and grabbing a seat in the same area where I had seen him. It felt almost inevitable. He glanced up as I sat, his expression neutral, but there was something in the way he held my gaze that made my pulse quicken. We exchanged a brief, polite nod, an acknowledgement of our past encounter. He didn't make any effort to approach me right away, and I respected that. It was clear that he wasn't going to force any kind of interaction. But as the minutes passed, I noticed he was glancing in my direction a bit more frequently, as if his curiosity mirrored my own. I ate my meal slowly, trying to act casual, but my mind was racing. What did I expect from this situation? A friendship? An apology for the weird way he had acted during our stop? A casual conversation? None of that felt right. Instead, there was this deep, unspoken question hanging between us. What was it about that night that had felt different? Finally, when I had finished, I rose to leave, but as I stood, I caught his eye once again. This time, he offered a small smile, one that was fleeting but sincere. There was something in it, a recognition of the moment we shared, and perhaps even a hint of understanding. I nodded back, a quiet exchange that spoke volumes. As I walked out, I couldn't help but feel like I had just crossed a threshold. The officer, Jared, as I later learned his name wasn't just a distant figure from a routine encounter. No, he was someone who had become a part of my daily life, someone whose presence felt more and more inevitable. Something was unfolding between us, and despite my best efforts to keep things at arm's length, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. It wasn't long before I found myself going back to Chipotle. The pattern was beginning to feel like more than just coincidence. I had no rational explanation for it, but I kept finding myself gravitating toward the same spot, the same corner where Jared sat each day. Maybe it was my need for routine, or maybe it was the growing curiosity I had about him. Either way, I didn't fight it. I was starting to feel a connection, however subtle, between us. Each time I returned, I found Jared there, quietly eating his lunch and seeming just as absorbed in his thoughts as I was in mine. There was something magnetic about him, something that drew me in every time. But what was it that made him stand out so much? Our conversations had been small at first, just pleasantries and casual talk about food or work, nothing too deep. But over the next couple of weeks, those exchanges began to shift. Our talks evolved into discussions about photography, something we both shared a passion for. I remember the first time he mentioned it. He had a camera on the table, the lens resting next to his burrito bowl. At first, I thought it was just an accessory, but then he explained that he enjoyed capturing moments during his free time. "I find it relaxing," he said, his fingers idly tapping the lens. "You'd be surprised how much beauty there is in the small things most people overlook." It's like you're seeing the world through a different lens. No pun intended. I smiled, feeling the weight of his words. It was a sentiment I shared wholeheartedly. I loved capturing life's quiet moments too, the candid expressions of strangers, the forgotten details of everyday life. Photography, for me, was an escape, a way to freeze time. I get that, I replied, feeling the walls between us start to crumble. There's something about finding beauty in the ordinary, right? Like a snapshot of the world that most people miss. Our discussions about photography became a bridge between us, one that connected us on a deeper level. We spoke about our favorite types of shots, our most cherished pictures, and the ways photography had shaped our perspective on life. Each conversation felt like a small unveiling, a way of getting to know each other without the pressure of anything more. It wasn't long before we started talking about more personal things, our childhoods, our families, the challenges we faced in our respective lives. Jared opened up to me in ways I hadn't expected. He spoke of the pressures of being a police officer, the weight of responsibility he carried every day. He mentioned how he had always struggled to reconcile the man he was with the uniform he wore. There were days when he felt like he didn't even recognize himself. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing, he admitted one day, his voice quieter than usual. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love what I do. I love the idea of protecting people. But there are days when I feel like I'm drowning in it all. And then there's this whole other side of me. The side I don't show anyone. The side I don't even know how to share. I listened intently, knowing that there was more to him than met the eye. It was clear that the uniform was just one layer of who he was. But the weight of it was something I could never fully understand, and yet, I was beginning to see how it shaped him. I shared my own struggles with him, too. The pressure of my job, the loneliness that sometimes crept in, the days when it felt like I was drifting through life, disconnected from everything. But somehow, in the presence of Jared, that loneliness seemed to ease. We had both created these invisible walls around ourselves, but here we were, opening up to one another in ways that felt effortless. Over time, the meetings at Chipotle became our sacred space, our little haven where we could speak freely without fear of judgment. The connection between us deepened, and with it, the unspoken tension began to grow. I could sense that Jared felt it too, this strange pull between us that we both struggled to understand. But the more time we spent together, the more I realized that whatever it was, it couldn't just be ignored. There was something real here, something worth exploring. One afternoon, as we sat across from each other, the conversation shifted from photography to something far more personal. It was then, in that quiet moment, that I realized how much Jared had come to mean to me. I didn't have all the answers, and I didn't know what would happen next. But I knew one thing for sure. This was no longer just a casual lunch with a stranger. This was something far more significant. Love. Have you ever felt an unexpected connection with someone? A pull so strong that it leaves you questioning everything you thought you knew about yourself? Have you ever found yourself torn between the intensity of your emotions and the weight of the world's expectations, unsure of how to move forward? I want to hear your story. Have you ever struggled with a connection like this? One that challenges every norm and forces you to confront your truest self? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'm eager to know how you navigated those moments. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to click like and subscribe for more stories that inspire, challenge, and connect us all. Stay tuned for the rest of the story. It's only just beginning.